Inside the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Bernie Sanders collide in a fierce congressional hearing over one burning crisis: how to stop America's income inequality, where billionaires grow richer while everyday families are crushed by unfair taxes. Bernie warns against moving too fast, urging caution and consensus. But Jasmine strikes back with blistering precision, dismantling not just Bernie's slow and steady strategy, but the very foundation of his philosophy. Their visions couldn't be more different, one rooted in caution, the other in confrontation. As tensions rise and the chamber holds its breath, one question crackles through the silence. When two justice warriors collide, who will lead the fight for America's economic soul? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The U.S. Capitol was charged with tension as the hearing began. This session focused on a crucial issue: how to combat income inequality and tax the rich. The room, filled with lawmakers and experts, was about to discuss the growing divide between the wealthy and the rest of America. Among those leading the discussion were Jasmine Crockett and Bernie Sanders. Jasmine, a dynamic and passionate lawmaker, was known for her fierce stance on social justice. She had long fought for the rights of marginalized communities and wasn't afraid to challenge the unfair systems in place. With urgency in her voice, she called for immediate, bold action to address the systemic inequality. On the other side, Bernie Sanders, the seasoned senator, championed progressive tax reform and had been advocating for taxing the rich for decades. However, his approach was more cautious, focused on gradual, long-term solutions. His belief was that change had to be built slowly, through broad political consensus. Despite their shared goal of reducing inequality, Jasmine and Bernie clashed over their methods. Jasmine demanded swift, radical change, while Bernie urged a more measured, strategic approach. Their differences set the stage for a heated debate on how to solve America's wealth gap. The air in the chamber had barely settled when Bernie Sanders adjusted his microphone and rose slowly to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers would do it for him. "Let's begin with what the Federal Reserve has confirmed," he said, holding up a printed report like a piece of damning evidence. 1% of Americans now control 40% of the wealth in this country. He turned, eyes scanning the room. Meanwhile, the bottom 50%, the half of this nation working the hardest, struggling the most, own just 2%. He let the silence stretch, heavy and accusatory. "This isn't a wealth gap," he said grimly. "It's an economic chasm designed to keep people down while a handful rise." Bernie took a breath, his voice tightening with conviction. "This is why I've called, again, for a serious increase in taxes on the ultra-rich and the corporations hoarding billions while millions suffer," he continued, tapping the edge of his prepared notes. "Not symbolic reform, real taxation, the kind that funds healthcare, housing, and human dignity." He held up a folder labeled Medicare for All, his signature proposal. "We tax wealth so we can protect life. If you can afford a yacht, you can afford to help a child get insulin. If your company posts $10 billion in profits, you can afford to help pay for universal health care. Then quieter but deadlier, if we don't act now, then we are no longer representatives of the people. We are accomplices to their suffering." Bernie's final words still echoed through the chamber when Jasmine Crockett rose. Not in opposition, but in escalation, her expression carved with urgency, as if truth itself were demanding more than careful compromise. She walked to the center of the room with measured defiance, the faint tap of her heels the only sound as every eye turned. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium, not for support, but to brace the weight of what she was about to unleash. "Senator Sanders is absolutely right," she began, voice steady, not soft. "This nation is drowning in inequality. But if we keep reaching for the same tools, the same incremental fixes, we're just rearranging furniture on a house that's already on fire." She paused, then lifted a printed chart from her binder, holding it high. "This is from Oxfam, 2020. While hundreds of millions were losing jobs, homes, and dignity during the pandemic, two men, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, increased their wealth by over $300 billion combined." Her eyes scanned the stunned committee, and at the same time, over 700 million people fell deeper into poverty. Globally, that is not imbalance. That is plunder. Her voice sharpened. This isn't just about taxes. This is about a structure that rewards exploitation at every level. We talk about raising rates on income, but billionaires don't live on income. They live on power, multiplied through loopholes, trusts, shell companies, and stock inflation. She pointed to another chart, one showing asset growth over wages. You raise the tax rate, they move assets. You close one door, they buy the building. Her tone was no longer a warning, it was an indictment. We cannot pretend that we're fixing injustice by polishing the surface. What Senator Sanders proposes is a start, but we are long past starting. The system is designed to regenerate inequality faster than we can regulate it. And if we are serious about justice, we can't just charge the players, we have to change the game. Her voice fell silent, but the tension she left in its place said everything else. But Jasmine wasn't finished, because behind every billionaire's fortune wasn't just a pile of money, but a labyrinth of protection built by policy, bought by influence, and enforced by silence. And today she would break that silence. D again. The next slide showed an IRS tax summary from 2021, her own annotations marked in red. The numbers are not secret, they are public, and they are damning. Her hand lifted the IRS compliance report high above her head like an indictment in court. This document, she said, walking slowly across the floor, proves that the richest Americans and their corporations are not avoiding taxes by accident. They are avoiding taxes by design. She flipped through highlighted passages. Deferred income, stock-based compensation, shell companies in Delaware, invisible subsidiaries in Bermuda, and my personal favorite, charitable foundations that funnel money right back to their own families while still collecting deductions. Her voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in emotional temperature. And every bit of it is legal, not moral, not fair, just legal enough to escape consequence. She turned to the audience, locking eyes with one representative after another. And who wrote those laws, she asked, her voice narrowing. Not working families, not small business owners. No, these rules were written in rooms far from this chamber, by lobbyists for billionaires, passed by people who accepted their checks. A brief silence fell, sharp as a blade. She pressed forward. A cashier making $28,000 a year pays more in taxes, in percentage terms, than Amazon. She doesn't get a deduction for writing off her groceries. She doesn't get to delay her income into a lower bracket. And she damn sure doesn't have a lawyer calling the IRS on her behalf. She pointed to the screen again. But Amazon does, and that's the difference. That's the betrayal. The lights in the room seemed harsher now. Her words had stripped the niceties away from the discussion. There was no more theory, no more abstraction, just reality laid bare. This isn't about whether we tax the rich, she said, slowing her tone. It's about whether we're willing to admit that the rich have already rigged the game, and we, the so-called representatives of the people, have watched it happen. Some of us, she glanced toward a few silent faces in suits, have helped it happen. A final click brought up her last slide, one that made the room visibly shift in their seats. It was a side-by-side comparison. A single mother earning minimum wage, paying 18.5% in combined federal and payroll taxes. Next to it, a tech billionaire who paid 3.2% on millions in net wealth increases thanks to capital gains deferral and offshore assets. These aren't just numbers, Jasmine said, her voice cracking like a dry branch. They are policy choices, and every time we choose to defend loopholes, to stall reform, to protect these job creators, we are making another choice too, to leave working Americans behind. Then, with perfect timing, she fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The chamber didn't breathe. That's when Bernie Sanders rose. His hands rested calmly on the table, but his shoulders carried the weight of decades in this fight. Congresswoman Crockett is right, he said, with a nod that wasn't just respectful. It was honest. What we are witnessing is not just tax avoidance, it is economic apartheid. He turned to the same chart Jasmine had shown and tapped it once with a forefinger that trembled, not from fear, but from age and fury. If a democracy allows the wealthiest to escape the obligations of citizenship, then it is no longer a democracy. It is a playground for oligarchs. He lifted a single sheet of paper, simple, clean, direct. That is why I propose a progressive tax code, not a band-aid, not a gesture, a structure. His finger moved down the margin. 10% on the bottom bracket, 25% on the middle, 40%, 50%, even 70% on extreme wealth. He looked up. Because if you earn billions while Americans sleep in their cars, your success has a price. The room stirred, but Bernie pressed forward. This is not punishment. This is fairness. This is ensuring that the janitor and the billionaire do not live in different nations under the same flag. His voice grew steadier as he framed his call. And with that revenue, he said, lifting the paper again, we fund Medicare for all. We eliminate premiums. We cancel medical bankruptcies. We close the door on profit in human suffering. He nodded toward Jasmine with something close to solemn reverence. Because she's right. People are tired of bandages on bullet wounds. It's time we stitch the whole thing up. The room felt smaller now, the distance between outrage and action closing inch by inch. Still standing, Bernie laid his final thought like a stone on the table. Let this hearing mark the moment we stopped apologizing for asking the rich to pay what they owe, and started building a country where working people can breathe again. The silence that followed wasn't from fear, it was from recognition. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. The chamber was still vibrating with tension when Jasmine stepped forward again. Not to reject Bernie's framework, but to tear the floorboards out from under it and expose what lay beneath. A system that taxed earnings while letting empires go untouched. Jasmine's expression had hardened into something colder, sharper. Not fury, focus. She turned her back to the committee for a moment, facing the towering digital screen as it displayed a familiar phrase, progressive income taxation. Then she turned around slowly, her voice slicing through the silence like the blade of a scalpel. We've spent decades pretending that taxing income is the same as taxing power, she began, her tone deliberate and devastating. It's not, because real power in America doesn't come from wages. It comes from what you own. She pointed to the screen, which now shifted to a chart from the Economic Policy Institute, EPI. This is the part of the story we never talk about. While income inequality has grown steadily, wealth inequality has exploded. And we're still chasing pay stubs while the billionaires hide their kingdoms in plain sight. She stepped forward, clicking the remote again. The screen displayed two columns, one labeled annual income, the other total net worth. In one row, a software engineer earning $160,000 a year with a modest home and savings. In the other, a hedge fund owner claiming only $600,000 in income, while sitting atop $900 million in assets. We could raise income taxes to the ceiling, Jasmine said, raising her voice slightly, and he would still walk away untouched. Why? Because we're taxing the wrong thing. We're looking at the fruit while ignoring the roots. The chamber had grown still again. Eyes drifted toward Bernie. Jasmine wasn't attacking him. She was demanding evolution. She lifted a thick binder labeled EPI 2022, Wealth Concentration Report, and flipped to a bookmark section. Her voice dropped an octave. According to this data, the top 0.1% of households in this country own as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. She raised her eyes. Let me say that again. The top 0.1%, roughly 160,000 households, own more than 290 million Americans put together. The number landed like a blow. Jasmine didn't flinch. So tell me, what good is an income tax when the real danger is not how much they earn, but how much they already own? She let the question hang, unanswered and undeniable. She clicked again. The image on screen changed to a map of Europe, with one country highlighted in bold blue, France. In 2017, France implemented what they called the Impôt de solidarité sur la fortune, a tax on personal net worth above 1.3 million euros, she said. It wasn't perfect, it was controversial, but it did something we've been too afraid to do. It forced the richest households to put something back into the society that made them rich. She turned toward the room, her voice hardening. This wasn't just about fairness. It was about survival, about pulling money off the sidelines and injecting it back into healthcare, education, and infrastructure. About clawing back opportunity from the vaults where it's been buried for generations. Her pace slowed, each step purposeful. That's what I'm proposing now, she said. A federal net wealth tax, not just a one-time surcharge, a permanent, tiered structure applied to fortunes above $50 million, tax shelters closed, assets audited, trust loopholes neutralized. She held up a page from her proposed legislation, bolded and annotated. If we fail to do this, if we keep pretending income is the only metric of economic justice, then we're chasing shadows while the real power consolidates in silence. She paused. What we need is not just a better tax code, we need a different lens. One that sees how power hides itself in property, in portfolios, in perpetual inheritance. The air had grown thicker now, not from heat but from pressure, the kind that builds before something breaks. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing just enough to sting. The truth is this, she said slowly. We've made taxation about productivity, about punishing people for working. But the system doesn't reward work. It rewards ownership. It rewards hoarding. It rewards those who make money by sitting still while others sweat. She glanced toward the camera, aware that millions were likely watching. And until we stop calling that prosperity and start calling it extraction, nothing will change. She stepped to the side of the podium, hands gripping both edges as if anchoring herself to the moment. Bernie's plan, raising income tax, is a foundation, but without a wealth tax, it's a dam with cracks. Every billionaire will keep slipping through. Every dynasty will keep buying silence. And every struggling American will keep wondering why their hard work never turns into freedom. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it was the most dangerous sound in the room. If we're not willing to tax what they hide, we're not taxing power. We're just taxing paychecks. With that, Jasmine didn't yield the floor. She stood silent, allowing her words to settle like dust after demolition. And in that quiet, the committee sat frozen, not out of disagreement, but because everything they'd built their arguments on had just been moved 2 inches off the ground. And they weren't sure yet where it would land. The chamber was still pulsing from Jasmine's thunderous call for a wealth tax. But amid the tremors, Bernie Sanders stepped forward, not to extinguish the fire, but to steady the flame before it consumed everything. Bernie's hands rested on the table, fingers splayed, eyes fixed on the center of the room like a soldier recalling a battlefield. His voice, when it came, didn't rise. It tightened, like the tension in a drawn bow. What Congresswoman Crockett demands, he began, is not wrong. It is righteous. But we must not mistake the sound of moral clarity for the absence of political landmines. The screen behind him flickered to a photo. President Obama signing the Affordable Care Act, flanked by cheers, hope, and cameras. Bernie turned to it, jaw clenched with memory. I was there. I saw what happened the moment we tried to deliver even a sliver of fairness to working people. His hand motioned through the air like cutting through smoke. Within hours, corporate lobbies mobilized with one mission, to destroy what we had built. He stepped forward, slower than Jasmine had, but no less determined. You don't need to imagine how they'll react to a wealth tax, he said, his voice now layered with tension. Just remember how they reacted to basic health care. Millions of dollars flooded into PACs overnight. Lies spread like wildfire. Death panels, they said. Government takeovers. They didn't just attack the policy, they attacked the idea of public good. His words hit like cold wind in a burning room, and they chipped it away. One repeal here, one legal challenge there, one budget cut at a time, until what we had left was a patchwork stitched together by executive orders and hope. He turned, locking eyes with Jasmine, not with resistance, but with gravity. So yes, he said, we must act. But we must act knowing the machine we're facing, because they're already preparing to destroy your bill before the ink is dry. He pointed up, toward the viewing gallery where corporate lobbyists sat in polished suits, silent, unreadable. These men? They don't blink at a wealth tax. They buy time. They fund think tanks. They twist public opinion like a lever until justice looks like chaos. Bernie's voice dropped to a growl. And the moment we overreach without an airtight coalition behind us, they'll paint us not as reformers, but as radicals threatening the order. His hand tightened into a fist on the lectern, not out of anger, but out of the weight of what he'd carried for decades. We cannot afford another Obamacare moment, he said. We cannot build a bold new policy only to watch it be torn apart in back rooms and courtrooms by those who never believe people deserve better. He looked back to the rest of the committee now. What Jasmine proposes will face opposition that is ruthless, well-funded, and relentless. They will not stop. They will not sleep. And unless we are 10 steps ahead, with a wall of public will behind us, they will win. Again. And then, with the quiet force of someone who had lived the cost of idealism, he ended. It's not enough to throw the first punch, no matter how righteous it feels. We must be strong enough to stand when they hit back. Bernie's words, grounded in the scars of political defeat, still lingered like smoke in the chamber. But Jasmine stepped back into the center of that storm, not to dismiss his experience, but to confront the paralysis it threatened to cause. Jasmine's voice returned with the clarity of someone who had heard too many reasons to wait. I understand your warning, Senator, she said, steady but relentless. But history doesn't remember the people who feared resistance. It remembers the people who forced it to reveal itself. She stepped forward again, her every movement charged with urgency. We don't get to say not yet when people are rationing insulin, when families are working 3 jobs and still sleeping in their cars, when the wealthiest companies in this nation are sucking public money dry and giving nothing back. Her tone didn't waver. It struck harder with each word. You want a case study in the cost of restraint? Let's talk about Boeing. She raised her hand and the screen behind her flared to life. An image of the Boeing logo beside a breakdown of federal tax subsidies. Her voice hardened. Over the past decade, Boeing has received more than $60 billion in federal contracts and tax breaks. $60 billion. And yet, what did they do with that public generosity? She clicked to the next slide. Mass layoffs, wage suppression reports, and a line chart of executive compensation rising like a missile launch. They cut thousands of workers. They froze salaries. They outsourced manufacturing to chase cheaper labor while pocketing taxpayer money meant to support American jobs. Her hand dropped to her side, clenched into a fist. And the man who presided over all of it, he left with a $62 million exit package. Her eyes swept the chamber now, not with outrage, but with icy precision. We keep saying we're afraid of retaliation if we go too far. But let me ask you, what do you think they've been doing to working people this whole time? She paused, letting the weight of the question settle in. Boeing didn't retaliate after reform. They retaliated in the absence of it. They exploited the system not because we pushed them, but because we didn't. She turned back to Bernie, this time with a voice carved from steel. You say they'll push back harder if we go bold. I say they already are. And we're still standing here, afraid to move. Jasmine stepped forward once more, her final tone low, unshaking, and surgical. If fear of opposition dictates the scale of our ambition, then the people who suffer don't just lose progress, they lose representation. Her hand hovered over the Boeing slide, then closed the file altogether. We do not serve the public by waiting for the right moment. We serve them by creating it, even if the cost is conflict. Because if the price of peace is silence, then we are already complicit in the theft we claim to condemn. And in the silence that followed, it was no longer just a question of strategy. It was a test of courage. As the echoes of Jasmine's fury over Boeing's subsidized greed faded into the hushed marble stillness of the chamber, she didn't pause, didn't breathe. Instead, she reached for a truth far darker, far deeper, and far more damning. A truth inked not in policy, but in evasion, loopholes, and smoke. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless at the podium, her fingers resting on a folder so thin it looked harmless, until she lifted it. The front read one phrase in bold block type, "The Paradise Papers." Her voice came low, deliberate. We've talked about the unfairness of wealth distribution. We've talked about the obscene profits and shrinking wages. But now we're going to talk about what happens behind the curtain, because this, right here, is where justice goes to die. She opened the folder slowly, revealing printouts of leaked documents, internal memos, and tax haven schematics. These are not rumors. These are not anonymous blog posts. These are contracts, filings, offshore holdings, signed, sealed, and exposed. She tapped the screen behind her, and a line appeared. Simple, brutal. 1% of Americans now control 40% of the nation's wealth. The bottom half? Just 2%. This isn't a byproduct of a free market, Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the tension. It's the result of tax policies engineered to look neutral, but designed to protect the fortress of generational wealth. And inside these papers, these leaked Paradise Papers, we see the blueprints. The screen flashed again, showing a graphic map of Bermuda, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, connected to the logos of Apple, Nike, and other giants. Jasmine didn't blink. These companies didn't just use tax havens. They built empires on them. Her fingers turned a page in the folder. Apple created a stateless shell company. No headquarters, no employees, no country of tax jurisdiction. It funneled $252 billion in profit through that structure. That's $250 billion hidden in plain sight. She clicked again. Nike developed a tax structure called Nike European Operations Netherlands BV, designed to shift revenues earned from sneakers made in Asia and sold in the U.S. through a Dutch subsidiary and onto Bermuda, where tax rates hit zero. And they did it with a smile, while their PR departments told the world they were investing in communities. Her voice trembled, not from uncertainty, but from fury so sharp it could shatter glass. Then came the moment that made the room hold its collective breath. Jasmine pulled out a printed internal memo, clearly marked as confidential. This document, she said, raising it into view, was obtained from the leaked papers. It outlines how executives strategized to exploit Ireland's double taxation loopholes, explicitly stating, "Our goal is to eliminate all visible tax liability within the U.S. over the next fiscal decade." A murmur stirred across the benches. One congressman dropped his pen. Jasmine didn't break focus. "That's not ambition, that's legalized theft. And we call it strategy because the people who suffer don't sit on boards or own islands." She stepped back from the screen, her presence commanding the oxygen from the room. "Let's call this what it is," she said. "A school teacher in rural Georgia pays 22% of her modest salary in federal income taxes. A grocery clerk in Phoenix pays more than Amazon, more than Facebook, more than a multinational hiding $10 billion in the Cayman Islands." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of the reality. And yet, every time we propose closing these loopholes, we're told it's too radical, too fast, too political. Well, let me ask, how political is it to let a rigged system hollow out our economy while children sit in schools without textbooks and veterans sleep in their cars? Jasmine closed the folder with a sharp snap. This system doesn't need tweaking, it needs a reckoning. She turned to the committee, her stare unwavering. We cannot talk about income inequality without confronting how the wealth was shielded, not just through broken laws, but through laws that were designed to break us. She pointed to the final slide, which showed a side-by-side image. A single mother with a W-2 tax form next to a billionaire's offshore trust documents. "Guess who the IRS audits more often?" she said. "It's not the man with the yacht. It's the mother with the child tax credit." Her voice dropped into a fierce whisper. "This is not a glitch. It's the core code of a system that punishes transparency and rewards secrecy." For a moment, no one moved. No one even shifted in their chairs. The documents on the screen were still visible, glowing like embers of truth too dangerous to ignore. Jasmine turned her gaze outward now, not to Bernie, not to the chairperson, but to the public, to the cameras, to the people beyond those walls. "They told us it was too complex to understand," she said. "They told us the system was too big to fight. But it's not complexity they fear. It's clarity. Because once the people see, they won't unsee. And once they understand, they will demand justice. Not later, but now." And with that, she stepped back, never raising her voice, but somehow shaking the foundations beneath them all. The chamber was still ringing from the exposure Jasmine had unleashed, but into that storm of outrage stepped a voice older than battle, not to douse the fire, but to remind everyone just how far the flames had to travel to burn through stone. Bernie Sanders adjusted his microphone with the slow precision of a man who had lived through too many betrayals to believe change came without cost. His eyes, shaded beneath heavy brows, swept across the room, landing not just on lawmakers, but on the invisible machinery behind them, the billionaires, the lobbies, the corporate media whispering behind every policy. I want to be very clear, he said, his gravelly voice rising not with passion, but with historical weight. I do not dispute the injustice Congresswoman Crockett has laid bare. What I question is whether this country, this government, will ever let it be corrected without a war of attrition. He reached into his own folder, this one worn from age, and pulled out a sepia-toned newspaper clipping from 1935. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the Wealth Tax Act, you would have thought he'd declared war on Wall Street. He held the page up. FDR is a threat to free enterprise, screamed the headline. The richest families in America, the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, organized against him. They accused him of class warfare, of trying to destroy America from within. Some even attempted to fund a military coup to overthrow the presidency and install a puppet regime loyal to corporate interests. His voice lowered, steady. That's not conspiracy. That's on record. Read the McCormack-Dickstein Committee findings. The room tightened. Jasmine stood still, her eyes narrowed, but respectful. Bernie went on. The backlash didn't stop with headlines. Lobbyists poured into D.C., weaponizing every newspaper, every radio station. The tax codes were watered down. Loopholes were slipped in. And even the reforms that passed were fought tooth and nail for decades. FDR may have won the battle, but only because he had a Great Depression at his back and a world war ahead of him. That is what it took to get modest fairness from a system that has always been built to protect power. He leaned forward. So when I say we should proceed strategically with caution, it's not out of fear. It's out of understanding just how brutal this fight becomes when we aim too high, too fast. He turned his gaze directly toward Jasmine now. I admire your fire, but fire alone won't burn through the walls they've built. They've been preparing for this battle long before you and I walk through these doors. Jasmine didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Then slowly she stepped forward, her heels clicking like gunfire in the chamber's hush. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave her arms. But the pressure in her words hit like steel against concrete. Senator Sanders, she said, her voice even, you just made the most powerful case for radical change and then asked us to pause. Her tone sharpened. You said they fought back against FDR. Yes, they did. You said they used fear tactics, lies, even plotted a coup. Yes, but the part you didn't say, the part I'm here to say, is that he did it anyway. He pushed through. And we remember him not for the backlash, but for the backbone. She looked out at the room now, as if daring the walls themselves to argue. We say we want change, but we keep designing it not to offend the people it's supposed to hold accountable. She raised her hand slightly, not to signal, but to emphasize. Every time someone stands up and says the rich should pay their share, the warning goes up like clockwork. Don't push too far, or they'll crush us. And that fear is the reason those changes never come. It is the single most effective weapon the elite have ever deployed. Not money, not media, hesitation. Her voice didn't shake. It struck. I didn't come to Congress to manage inequality like it's a budget item. I came to dismantle the systems that perpetuate it. And I will not ask the people dying from poverty, rationing insulin, or working 3 jobs to wait while we fine-tune a strategy to keep the rich comfortable. She walked a few steps closer to Bernie now, just enough to make the air between them crackle with tension. You've spent your life fighting this fight, but I need you to hear me. This generation is done waiting for permission from a system that profits from their silence. And if you think we'll lose because we dared to go big, then I ask you, what exactly have we won by going small? She paused there, letting the question thunder louder than any shout. If fear was going to protect the working class, it would have by now, but it hasn't, and it won't. Her eyes didn't blink. The only thing fear has done is buy time for billionaires. She stepped back, chin high, not in defiance, but in full command. And as silence fell once more, the war wasn't theoretical anymore. It was personal. It was now. As the echoes of her confrontation with Bernie faded into the silence of reckoning, Jasmine didn't let the weight of history paralyze her. She weaponized it. With the fire of defiance behind her, she pivoted, not away from the battlefield, but toward the future she refused to let die in theory. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward once more, the lights above throwing sharp shadows across her face, but not her resolve. "Let me make something absolutely clear," she began, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "This conversation is not just about what we've been through. It's about what we refuse to accept one day longer." She held up a new folder, a different one, its cover emblazoned not with scandals or leaks, but a word that still made too many in the room flinch. Welfare. I'm not here to nibble around the edges. I'm here to build something bigger than fear, something rooted in justice. And it starts with a bold, unapologetic, fully funded social safety net. She tapped the folder once against the lectern and opened it to a slide. Bright, clean, data-heavy, Denmark's welfare spending per capita. In Denmark, taxes on high income hover around 55%. And what do people get? Universal health care, free college, public housing that doesn't look like punishment, parental leave that doesn't bankrupt families, retirement that doesn't mean poverty. She stepped aside, letting the numbers hang in the air. They tax the rich, yes, but more importantly, they invest in their people. Her tone sharpened. Meanwhile, in America, we tax the middle class and let billionaires build rocket ships while kids drink lead-contaminated water. She flipped to another slide, two bar graphs side by side. One labeled U.S. Billionaire Wealth Growth, 2020 to 2023. The other, number of Americans living below the poverty line. The contrast was grotesque. This is not a crisis of capacity, it's a crisis of will. Jasmine's hands gripped the edge of the lectern now. And the question isn't whether we can afford it. The question is, how long are we going to keep pretending that we can afford not to? She nodded toward a gallery member wearing an oxygen tube. When you ration insulin because some hedge fund is playing Monopoly with your life, that's a policy choice. When you graduate college with $200,000 in debt just for the crime of wanting an education, that's a policy choice. She took a breath, not to soften, but to reset. "Let me tell you what my proposal looks like." Her tone was calm now, but charged with purpose. A national wealth tax on all assets over $50 million, modeled after the policies of Sweden and Norway. That revenue feeds into a federal education fund, universal pre-K, free community college, and tuition-free public universities. We'll use it to build 2 million new public housing units, repair another 3 million, and end homelessness among veterans and children within 5 years. She raised her eyes, daring them to challenge her math. "This isn't fantasy. This is arithmetic. Once we stop designing our tax code to protect yachts instead of babies." A new slide. This time it wasn't data, it was faces. Children in underfunded classrooms, elderly women in food pantry lines, nurses on strike holding signs that read, "Patience before profits." Jasmine's voice dropped, but the power in it swelled. This country spends more per capita on healthcare than any nation on earth, and yet we have the worst outcomes in the industrialized world. Because it's not a healthcare system, it's a profit machine. She slammed the folder shut. "I'm done asking poor people to subsidize the comforts of the wealthy. We're flipping the formula." Then she delivered the final pivot, one that brought the room to an uneasy stillness. "You want to talk about the Nordic model? Fine." She leaned into the mic. Those countries didn't just achieve lower inequality. They achieved higher trust, lower crime, better mental health outcomes, longer life expectancy. Because when a nation invests in its people, it becomes a place worth believing in. She pointed again at the data. You don't get riots when the people have roofs. You don't get despair when the people have dignity. A single beat passed before she added, slower now. "We've accepted a false gospel that says asking billionaires to pay their share is un-American. But you know what's un-American?" Her eyes locked onto the cameras. A child in Mississippi dying of asthma because the air is poisoned. A working mother in Detroit choosing between rent and chemotherapy. A teacher in Arizona buying pencils out of her own paycheck. She straightened up, unapologetic. "This is the richest country in the history of civilization, and we are failing by design. She let that silence hang, not to pause, but to signal that the next breath would be action. This proposal isn't radical. The neglect is. This redistribution isn't dangerous. The hoarding is. And if we truly want to build back better, we can't build on a foundation of hunger and unpaid bills. We must build on fairness, on contribution, on the kind of justice that doesn't trickle down, it rises up. And then her final words, cut clean through the chamber like a verdict. We've spent decades asking, how much can we cut? Now it's time to ask, how much can we care? Jasmine's voice had just finished echoing off the chamber walls, a call to arms so fierce it felt like it could split marble. But as the adrenaline quieted into breathless tension, it was Bernie who stepped forward, not as an opponent, but as the voice of caution forged from 1,000 legislative battles lost to haste. Bernie Sanders didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply leaned into the microphone, his fingers wrapped tightly around the edges of the podium, like someone gripping the wheel of a ship in rough water. "Let me be clear," he began slowly, every syllable carrying the weight of decades in the fight. "I have stood where you stand, Congresswoman. I have felt that fire, burned by it, led by it. But I've also watched it be extinguished, not by injustice, but by impatience." A hush settled again, not of dismissal, but of reckoning. Bernie's voice deepened. In 2017, Donald Trump signed into law one of the most reckless tax overhauls this country has ever seen. A $1.9 trillion windfall for the ultra-wealthy passed in just 7 weeks. No hearings, no expert reviews, no transparency. And the result? Not growth, not opportunity, a rigged explosion of inequality. Corporate buybacks skyrocketed, wages flatlined, the deficit ballooned. But do you know what was worse? He paused, scanning the room. The public backlash faded. People stopped paying attention because they never understood what had been done to them. It happened too fast, and the damage was too quiet. He exhaled, measured and grim. If we try to reverse that with a revolution just as hasty, however noble, we risk the same fate. We risk reforms built on weak foundations, policies that crumble at the first swing of a right-wing majority. We risk empowering those very forces we seek to defeat by giving them ammunition to paint us as radicals rather than reformers. Jasmine's face stayed composed, but the flicker in her eyes revealed her restraint. Bernie continued, unflinching. This isn't about ideology, this is about durability. If we want to rebuild the tax code in the name of justice, we must do it with steel, not sentiment, with legal armor, airtight data, and public backing so strong that no amount of dark money or media distortion can tear it down. He tapped his stack of papers. That means strategic phasing. It means starting with ironclad reforms, closing offshore loopholes, enforcing corporate minimum taxes, auditing the top 1% with full funding for the IRS. We build public trust there. Then we advance. Wealth taxes, capital levies, full progressive restructuring. But we don't blow through the gates without making sure the bridge can hold. The tension in the room didn't ease, but it shifted. Bernie wasn't shrinking from the fight. He was trying to make sure it lasted. Then gently he added, "Congresswoman Crockett, I admire your fire. I've waited a lifetime to see leaders like you emerge. But if we act without anchoring our vision in the realities of political backlash, we won't just lose the battle. We'll make it harder for the next generation to even try." Jasmine stepped forward again, her heels striking the floor like punctuation. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. When she spoke, her tone was calmer, but just as electric. "Senator Sanders," she began, "I do not disagree with your facts. I disagree with what we've been trained to do because of those facts." Her hands opened in frustration and conviction. "We keep talking about backlashes like they're worse than injustice, like it's better to move slowly through suffering than to risk waking the people who cause it." She gestured toward the gallery again, where a mother sat holding a toddler wrapped in a medical blanket. That child doesn't have 10 years for strategic consensus. That mother doesn't need another pilot program or bipartisan delay. What she needs is courage from people in this room, not just from me, from you, from all of us. But then Jasmine surprised the room. Her voice softened. not in defeat, but in maturity. That said, I know fire without foundation burns itself out. I'm not here to burn. I'm here to build. And if what you're offering is a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of justice, then I will meet you there, but not an inch behind it. Bernie looked at her, and for the first time that day there was no conflict in his eyes. Only gravity, a tired, aching kind of hope. He leaned forward again. Then let's draft it, together. There was no applause, no music swelled, but something in the room shifted, a fragile kind of power, not yet victorious, but finally aligned. Two warriors, two visions, now one purpose, a tax code that serves the people, and a nation no longer built on hoarded wealth, but on shared dignity. As the echoes of consensus settled into the wood-paneled silence, Jasmine Crockett rose again, not to win the argument, but to carve the closing words into the conscience of a nation. She stood slowly, not as a legislator requesting attention, but as a force stepping into her full, undiluted fire. The marble walls of the hearing chamber seemed to tighten around her, as if the room itself knew this moment was about more than policy. Jasmine took the floor not with hesitance, but with the calm of someone who had carried too many truths for too long to speak softly now. Her voice began, low and tempered. "What we've done here today," she said, pausing as eyes fixed on her, "is not enough. But it matters. It matters because we didn't just trade speeches. We drew lines. We showed this nation what happens when truth enters a room that's used to silence." She glanced around the chamber, past Bernie, past the cameras, and toward the gallery where ordinary citizens sat like shadows of the stories never told. But we are not done, because for every dollar hoarded offshore, for every billionaire's yacht untaxed, and every single mom's groceries taxed to the bone, there is a child, a veteran, a teacher, a worker, waiting for justice that always seems to arrive too late or not at all. She held up a document, one sheet, a chart, but not one of abstract GDP curves. This one came from the IRS. A simple breakdown. Amazon's 1.2% tax rate versus the 22% average paid by middle-income families. "This is not oversight," she said coldly. "This is engineered betrayal, and we've allowed it because we fear the backlash more than we fear the consequences of inaction." She leaned into the mic now, her voice sharp. "They tell us to be cautious, to wait, to aim for what's politically viable. But I ask you, was slavery ended by what was viable? Was civil rights won by what was safe? Did FDR build the New Deal by asking J.P. Morgan if they approved?" The chamber held its breath. Every empire of injustice is built on two things: silence and delay. And every time this body tells the American people, we need more time, what we really mean is, we're letting the corporations write the clock. She stepped out from behind the desk. Her heels echoed like warning shots. "Look around you. Look at the headlines. Look at the lobbyists who'll flood this room tomorrow with smiles and veiled threats. Look at the men who have turned tax evasion into national sport, whose idea of contribution is buying another senator's vote." A flicker of pain passed across her face, a wound carried, not shown. "And still, we hesitate." She reached into her folder again and pulled a child's drawing, done in crayon, a stick figure standing beside a tall woman in a blue dress. The caption? "Ms. Jasmine helps moms like mine." Her hands didn't shake, but her voice softened. "This was mailed to my office from a housing project in Dallas, a place where the school had to cancel lunch programs because of budget cuts tied directly to corporate tax breaks." She folded the drawing carefully, reverently. "I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to remind you what this costs. Every time we postpone action in the name of strategy, we choose wealth over people. Every time we water down our bills to satisfy donors, we are saying that campaign checks matter more than chemotherapy." Her next breath came slow, but volcanic. "To those watching who call this radical, let me say this. It is radical to let billionaires dodge taxes while children sleep in cars. It is radical to call this a democracy while letting two hedge funds own most of our media. It is radical to tell people in Flint to drink poison while ExxonMobil rakes in billions in subsidies. A silence, thick as grief, filled the air. But here's the truth, Jasmine said, lifting her chin. This fight is not just winnable, it is inevitable. Because justice always finds its reckoning. The only question is, will we be remembered as the ones who delayed it, or the ones who dared to deliver it? She turned toward Bernie now. Her voice didn't challenge, it invited. We may differ in tempo, Senator Sanders, but I believe in your integrity, and I ask that you believe in my urgency. Let's not let another year pass with toothless reforms and bipartisan eulogies. Let's write legislation with backbone. Let's craft tax law that remembers who built this country, not just who owns it. She stepped back to the desk and laid her palm flat on its oak surface. To every member of Congress in this room, and to every American listening, I don't want your applause. I want your courage. I want your vote, not because it's safe, but because it's right. Then her voice dipped, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like glass. This may be just another hearing to some of you, but to the family evicted last night, to the teacher skipping insulin to buy supplies for her classroom, to the veteran waiting in a broken VA lobby, this is the moment that will define whether we were complicit or we finally rose. Her closing line landed with the weight of scripture. We were not elected to protect the powerful. We were sent here to confront them. And with that, Jasmine Crockett didn't sit. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the hearing chamber. A silhouette of defiance wrapped in resolve. No one moved. No one spoke. Because for that one instant in American political theater, the script was broken, and the truth, naked and undeniable, stood center stage. As the weight of Jasmine's words still lingered in the air like smoke after a battlefield volley, Bernie Sanders slowly leaned forward, not to extinguish the fire, but to anchor it in the long, hard soil of persistence. His fingers curled around the microphone, not trembling, but firm, like hands that had gripped the rails of 1,000 uphill climbs. The chamber was still electrified, the silence brittle. Bernie cleared his throat, not out of weakness, but out of reverence for the storm that had just passed. And then, with the steady cadence of a man who had seen decades rise and fall on Capitol Hill, he spoke. My friends, he began, his tone softer than Jasmine's but no less resolute. We just heard a voice of righteous urgency, and make no mistake, that urgency is justified. The pain is real. The injustice is staggering. But I ask you to remember this. The road to justice has never been paved in one day. His eyes scanned the room, not just to meet glances, but to measure resolve. It takes steps. It takes sweat. It takes staying in the fight even when the headlines move on. He raised a hand, not to silence, but to clarify. Let me be clear. I have no disagreement with the spirit of my colleague's words. We must fight for the working class. We must tax the wealthy. We must dismantle the oligarchy that has hijacked our democracy. But the history of progress teaches us something vital, that if we swing too wildly, too fast, they will shut the doors before we've even stepped through. There was no condescension in his voice, only the rough weariness of someone who had learned this the hard way. He leaned in now, his words gaining volume. In the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was called a traitor to his class because he dared to tax the wealthy. And even then, he was nearly broken by corporate lobbies. The New Deal was not a single law. It was a movement built one plank at a time over years through strikes, protests, and negotiations. And still today, pieces of it are being clawed apart. His voice cracked slightly, but not from age, from conviction. We cannot afford to lose what little we've built. We must move forward, but we must move forward in a way that survives the backlash. Because believe me, it's coming. He pointed to the gallery above. Right now, billionaires are watching this hearing, not in fear, but in calculation. They are funding PACs. They are mobilizing think tanks. They are calling senators with threats wrapped in politeness. They are building counter-legislation before our ink even dries. He paused. And if we overreach without securing the battlefield, we will lose this war. Not because we were wrong, but because we weren't ready. Then he shifted, not away from principle, but toward unity. That is why I'm asking every person here, every citizen watching, every legislator with a spine, do not walk away from this debate thinking it is Jasmine's plan or mine. It is both of ours. It is every honest worker's. It is every overworked nurse's. It is every student drowning in debt and every elder choosing between rent and medicine. He lifted a folder of handwritten letters, dozens. I carry these with me, notes from people in Flint, in Appalachia, in Southside Chicago, in forgotten zip codes, in boarded-up towns. They don't care if we pass reform in the name of Crockett or Sanders. They just want to know if we're still fighting for them. He paced slightly, his steps deliberate, grounded. The question before us is not whether we want justice. That answer is clear. The question is whether we will build a strategy that can outlast the resistance, one that turns popular anger into legislative pressure, one that survives the midterms, the smear ads, the lobbyist campaigns. Then his voice softened unexpectedly. You see, my friends, change is not just a moment. It's a series of choices, and we stand at a fork, down one road, boldness without coordination and risk of collapse. Down the other, cautious endurance and the chance to build something that lasts. He took a breath and spoke slowly. I am not asking anyone here to slow down. I am asking you to hold fast, hold to your principles, hold to each other, hold to the people who sent us here. Not the headlines, not the fundraisers, not the donors. Them. The people. He turned to Jasmine with a nod. Not concession, not submission, but deep, strategic respect. Congresswoman Crockett fights with a fire we need, and if we pair that fire with a foundation, then there is no force, no lobby, no billionaire, no party machine that can stop us. Then he faced the chamber fully once more. So let's march together. Let us craft tax policy that bleeds corruption out of this economy. Let us fund the schools, the clinics, the homes our people deserve. Let us build coalitions so wide they cannot be ignored, so diverse they cannot be divided. He raised a hand, not in defense, but as a call. Do not mistake gradualism for surrender. When we pass one bill, just one, to close a loophole that steals billions from the Treasury, we strike a blow against the empire of greed. When we fund one community clinic from fair taxes, we crack the foundation of inequality. Change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's relentless. Bernie's voice found its final height now, not booming, but grounded in grit. So yes, let's be impatient in our hearts. Let's burn with justice. But let's build like architects, not arsonists. Let's carve this mountain inch by inch until the summit is not a dream, but a road. And then, after a beat of silence, he delivered his final line, not with drama, but with gravity. Because the poor can't wait, but neither can they afford for us to fail. He sat down, not to yield, but to hand off the baton to everyone in the room. The room did not erupt, it tightened, with the shared realization that there were no heroes here, only responsibilities. And in that moment, under the dome of a capital too often ruled by inertia, strategy finally shook hands with urgency. As Bernie's final appeal for gradualism hung in the air, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the moral weight of the entire debate. Jasmine didn't stand again, but her silence carried the force of everything unspoken. The time for caution had already cost too much. What remained was not a clash of policies, but a confrontation with conscience. Jasmine Crockett had not just presented data, she had dragged injustice out of the shadows and into the hearing lights. Her arguments had peeled away the decorum that often hides brutality and bureaucracy. What was left, exposed and undeniable, was a system designed to protect those who already had more than they needed, at the expense of those who had never had enough to survive. The lesson wasn't buried in charts. It pulsed through every example she cited, every name she invoked, every loophole she shattered. She wasn't speaking to win a debate. She was speaking for people who couldn't afford to lose another generation. Her moral warning was simple. If we keep waiting for the perfect moment, we are letting injustice win in real time. Jasmine had spoken of Amazon paying just 1.2% in taxes, of billionaires offshoring wealth, while working-class families lived paycheck to paycheck. But those facts were more than shocking. They were personal indictments of national failure. The tax code wasn't neutral, it was rigged. And in every deduction granted to a corporation, there was a service denied to a citizen. She refused to let that injustice stay invisible. Her voice had carried a deeper call. To recognize that inaction is not neutrality, it's complicity. The real divide wasn't between left and right. It was between those willing to challenge power and those too comfortable to care. And that was her most dangerous message of all. Because Jasmine didn't just call out the rich, she called out the system that enabled them. The senators who looked away, the voters who shrugged, the media that normalized suffering. She turned the entire hearing into a mirror and forced everyone watching to see who they really were in the reflection. But even in that harsh light, she offered a different kind of hope. Not one of handouts, but of reckoning, of restoring balance, of taking what had been hoarded through injustice and using it to build something fair. Her lesson wasn't vengeance. It was redemption through courage. She spoke of Denmark's tax-funded social programs, not as fantasy, but as proof. She reminded them that justice was possible, but only when morality had more power than money. You can't serve the people, she'd said, if you're too afraid to upset the powerful. That wasn't politics. That was a warning, and the chamber knew it. Because Jasmine's closing moments weren't the end of a debate. They were the beginning of a line in the sand. Her message was clear. Either we confront the system now, or we remain accessories to its cruelty. There would be no passive role left to play, no applause line to hide behind. The injustice had been documented, the stakes had been named, the blood price had been counted. And for those who chose silence now, history would remember them accordingly. That was the deepest lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind in that echoing hall. That morality, real morality, is disruptive. It demands that we risk our comfort, that we break with tradition, that we challenge not just the villains, but the structure that made villainy profitable. And in doing so, she hadn't just changed the tone of the hearing. She had changed the terms of the fight, not left versus right, not radical versus moderate, but cowardice versus conviction. And she had made her side unmistakably clear. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.